Okay, welcome to the closing plenary of MCN 2011. This is the Great Debate, and we have one proposition to debate today. We're going to be done a little early, so we can all hit the bar ahead of time. Hang in there, though. This is going to be good. All right, so the proposition that we're going to be debating today is there are too many museums. It's a deliberately provocative proposition, but it's also one that we believe is pretty timely, straightforward, and also that touches on a number of themes from this year's conference. I'm going to do a brief introduction, and then we're going to hit it. As the organizer of this event, I have the great pleasure of choosing the debaters and assigning them to teams. And I have to say that more than one of you has actually challenged me about a line from the session abstract that describes these debaters as our community's best and brightest and most charismatic and endearing personalities. Some of you seem to think that one of these teams represents the best and brightest, and one charisma and charm, but this is not the case. Or if it is, I'll leave that up to you to decide. From my point of view, all four of these very brave souls represent all of these things. And before we get started, I thought I'd give you some brief introductions to who they are. I know that most of you know everybody up here and have been listening to them all week long, but just briefly. By the way, I'm Susan Chun, I'm your moderator. Hi, I know most of you as well. I'm going to introduce the debaters in the order in which they're going to first speak. Okay, Mia Ridge is going to speak first for the affirmative. She is a cultural heritage technologist who's worked internationally as an analyst, consultant, and developer at a number of UK institutions, including the Science Museum, NMSI, and the Museum of London. Mia's doctoral research at the Open University focuses on crowdsourcing, the digitization, aggregation, and geolocation of historical materials. Rob Stein, down there on the end, is going to speak second. He is the Indianapolis Museum of Art's Deputy Director, Technology Research and Engagement. The IMA lured Rob to the museum community in 2006 from his job at the Visualization and Interactive Spaces Lab at Indiana University. And since then, he and his team have changed the face of museum technology as brilliant and effective champions of collaborative community design technology projects. I had the great pleasure. Not so? Sounds good. All right. I had the great pleasure of sharing the role of project lead for the Steve Project with him for a number of years, and I honestly can't imagine what I ever did before I knew Rob. Bruce Wyman, right here next to me, has been one of my most cherished friends since 2006. That's just 6 years, but I count that as double because Bruce speaks so quickly that we've actually squeezed in 12 years of conversation.
The years before that didn't count?
The years before? I didn't know you before that. Last year's inaugural debate was in fact sort of organized to take advantage of Bruce's skill at fast talking, and he and Rob are back because they made such a great impression on the audience last year. Bruce is Director of Creative Technologies at Portland's Second City Interactive Studios, where he develops projects and provides strategic leadership for Second Story's many culture sector clients. He was formerly Director of Technology at the Denver Museum of Art. And Rosanna Flutie, like Mia, is an advanced degree candidate. She's pursuing a PhD in urban education with a focus in interactive technology and pedagogy at the Graduate Center of CUNY, the City University of New York. But like Mia, Rosanna was a very accomplished museum professional before she went back to school. She was associate director at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston, where she pioneered work with teen programs in museums, and at the Guggenheim Museum in New York before that, was instrumental in easing the museum into the adoption of new media in education programs. So those are your debaters, and I'm sorry about that. I'm going to let you go back through those so that you can get those Twitter handles. All right. The last thing is that you, the audience, are an important part of this debate. We are relying on you to vote. You will vote for the winners, to ask the important questions, and indeed to use the online debate tool at Barkles to add your thoughts to this question. So there you go. Have a look. I'm very, very fond of debate formats, and one of the things that you will find is that right now there are all kinds of new tools for supporting debate online. Barkles is just one of them. All right, I'm going to do a quick review of the format. I've assigned the debaters to teams. They didn't get to pick. And to their side on the affirmative or negative. And they've been asked to craft the best possible argument for their side. It's important to them that you know that they are not always going to be arguing a position that is a personally and strongly held belief, that they are charged to make the best argument for their side of the proposition. So that said, we will begin with statements by each of our speakers. The teams have designated the order in which they'll speak, so you'll hear first from Mia, then from Rob for the negative, followed by Bruce for the affirmative, and last, Rosanna for the negative. These statements will represent the basic arguments that each side is presenting. After the opening statements, the panelists will entertain questions from the audience. These are a really important part of our debate, and last year they really helped to catalyze and advance the argument. We were really delighted by the strength and value of the audience participation. Nobody pontificated, and if you do this year, I'll call you on it. The questions were brief and pithy and interesting. We will limit answers in the section to 1 minute each. After the audience cross-examination, the panel will have an opportunity to cross-examine each other. There's a slightly complicated format for doing that, but you'll see how it rolls out when we get there. And followed by that, there will be closing statements by each of the two teams and a vote by you on the winner. And then there's some other stuff, special surprises planned for you by the MCN board that will follow all of this in the program. So I am not going to say very much more except this. As one does in a formal debate, that we met beforehand to talk about definitions. There's only one key definition. It is the definition of museum. We agreed together on a modified version of the ICOM definition of museum. A museum is a nonprofit permanent institution in the service of society and its development, open to the public. The main reason that we needed to define this way is that obviously when we're talking about too many and quantity and quality probably, we wanted to make sure that we excluded your mother's online museum of bottle caps and that sort of thing. So anyway, that's the definition that we are working from. All right? So I'm going to get us started. All right.
You're going to vote?
Sorry. Yes, we're going to vote. I am going to, all right. So there's a little bit of a trust thing going on here. We take a vote at the beginning of the debate. We take a vote at the end. Your president, Christina DiPaolo, has volunteered to again act as our poll sitter and will be counting votes at the end of the session. But for right now, we're going to ask you to vote right now by show of hands whether or not you agree with the proposition, which is there are too many museums, or whether you disagree with the proposition there are too many museums. So I'm going to start with people who agree there are too many museums. Hands up. Okay. All right. And you're on camera here, by the way. Anna here is videotaping. Thank you, Anna, so much. This is people. Okay, wait, one more time. Since some of you put your hands back up, I agree with the proposition there are too many museums. Okay, hands up, hands down. Hands up, I disagree with the proposition there are too many museums. Okay, that's about half and half. Would you say that's about half and half?
60-40.
Okay.
50-50.
60-40.
From up here,
Ugh.
definitely.
All right. All right. That's good. That's
Only
good.
the beautiful people agree with the proposition.
That is very good. All right. Okay. So please remember your vote. We're counting on you to play fair. All right. Mia.
Okay, well, I'm really sorry. I've come all the way from Oxford and I've got bad news. There are too many museums. According to an international survey from UNESCO earlier this year, 1 in 5 museums cannot secure their windows or their doors. So you won't be surprised to learn that 1 in 10 museums have a major problem with theft. If we can't currently fund museums well enough to protect their collections, let alone research and communicate them, I'd say we have too many museums. It gets worse. Arguably, trust is the one asset museums have that's more important, rarer, and more precious than collections and the knowledge around them. But we risk losing the trust of the public if we prove unable to look after the things that they've trusted us with, the collections, their heritage. If we're unable to present a modern face to the world, unable to assert our relevance in the lives of our audiences. So we've already learnt that we can't protect our collections. Do we really want to keep stretching museum resources so thinly that we lose trust too? In the past few years, museum resources have been cut, but expectations have remained high. And you're probably all sitting in the seats going, yeah, you know this, you're living the reality of this. How long can we ask museums to do more with less? How long before museum staffers are stretched so thin that they snap? Worse, how long before the impact of ongoing cuts, of doing less with more, impacts the quality of the audience experience? Museums are competing for scarce resources, the time and money of our visitors, with other visitor attractions, with the distractions of the internet and television. As the quality of the museum experience crumbles under these ongoing funding cuts, we become a less competitive option for our visitors' precious time and money. We must act boldly now to secure the future of museums. Research shows that the memories kids have of museums is a key factor in determining whether they visit museums as adults. If we're stretched so thin just keeping the doors open that we end up lowering our standards, then how can we create those awesome, inspiring experiences that are going to create the next generation of museum goers? Acknowledging that there are too many museums isn't a vote for you or someone like you to lose your job. The reality is we're already losing staff. Education and outreach programs are closing, collections are being mothballed. It's better to face up to reality than to shut your eyes and hope it's all going to go away. We know the financial crisis that's impacting museums isn't going to go away anytime soon. Nobody wants there are too many museums to be true, but the sad fact is that we have too many museums for sustainability right now. It's not a moral question, it's a pragmatic one, it's an economic question. Museums must face up to reality. We must take control of our destiny and find creative solutions, configure new museums. Because if we don't, the only alternative that museums face is a slow death by 1,000 cuts.
Nice. Okay, for the brunette team, Rob Stein. Ready?
Okay, well, I traveled all the way from Indianapolis to tell you good news that there, in fact, are not too many museums at all. My teammate and I both emphatically refute the claim that there are too many museums, and in fact, we would like to suggest that there are far too few museums. According to the definition that we agreed on in the beginning of this debate, a museum is specifically defined by an international standards body as one that delivers service to society and its development. You might also call this public value, good in your community, winning the goodwill and the appreciation of your audiences. Now, this is an important point that we'll come back to over and over again. I think the important things to consider along with that definition is what it does not say. It does not say that every museum is a big museum. In fact, some are very, very small. We wish there were more of you small museums here in this room today, but in fact, it's really true that some small museums are doing incredible public service in their communities. Many museums even have no objects, but only ideas, and in fact, the definition allows for collecting both tangible and intangible resources. Some museums have no staff, no building, and no budget to speak of. but by definition, all museums exist to serve our societies and deliver the public value. Now, let's be very clear. Just because someone slaps the word museum on the front door of a building doesn't actually make it one. If that museum isn't abiding by the terms of the definition that we agreed to, then for this debate, we can't consider it. So we assert that there is no theoretical upper limit to the number of museums that might exist. In fact, the number of museums, rather, is related to their success in delivering values to their community. Stephen Weil is one of my favorite authors, and his quote from Making Museums Matter says, "Museums matter only to the extent that they are perceived to provide the communities that they serve something of value beyond their own mere existence." So we want to talk about some aspects of value. Today we're going to talk to you about the fiscal impact, the social impact, the quality of life, and we will furthermore assert something very important. We want to point out to you, and it's very clear to each one of you, and in fact, we appreciate the opposition for raising it. Museums exist in an economy that is self-regulating. It's a fiscal economy that it's also one of goodwill. Only good museums will actually survive, but their survival isn't artificially limited by some upper limit of counting too many. An important paper from Falk and Deerking pointed out that if museum goers did not continue to derive deep intrinsic rewards from going to museums, they would not keep going. We need museums that deliver on public value now more than ever. A museum that doesn't deliver public value is no museum at all.
All right, the second set of arguments are 4 minutes each. We begin with Bruce Wyman for the affirmative. Ready? Let me know when you, okay.
You know, Rob, it's an interesting proposition to think that the possibility that we could have, really 1,000 museums blooming around, tens of thousands of museums, it's a hopeful proposition, but at the end of the day, there's a level of adult responsibility that we need to encourage to take on ourselves. The fundamental dilemma is we don't want to have a bold embrace for the slide of mediocrity as we have tens of thousands of museums around the world, all with ever decreasing standards of quality, a finite element of being able to collect resources and having elements of a collection, and then sub-professional standards of quality of the professional workforce that goes into play here. The real problem isn't that we're looking at the definition of what a museum is, right? The dilemma is we don't want to look at semantics of that. That becomes a trivial issue, right? It's very easy to declare that based on the definition that you're looking at, Rob, that indeed your mother's Hummel collection is a worthwhile element of what a museum could be. But the definition actually, if we go back to it, Rob, is that it was supposed to be a permanent institution, right? And that's supposed to be the outside of it. It's not that it's it's only a set of intangible things, it's a set of concrete ideas, but rather that it also has some permanence and some history. It is the harbinger of what is valued in society and the elements that make it real. The thing that's also important, and this is one of the things that really fundamentally troubles me, is that you go out of your way to point out that they can collect intangible things, and that is such an art museum attitude, right? The real dilemma is that there are about 900 million visitors annually to museums across the United States. Art museums and those kinds of institutions that are built on a basic collection actually only expect to be about 45 million people of that total attendance. The reality is that many of our museums are built around ideas, around concepts. Science museums and technology centers in particular have long been founded on that principle, so clearly it's been established. But the more fundamental issue is that we want to make sure things are sustainable over the long term. I don't want to see more museums kind of get built up, that we keep adding resources for it, and they don't ultimately end up going anywhere in the grand scheme of things. There are a number of studies that are unfortunate, that look at kind of the current economic conditions and the cycle of what museums are going through. You're right, there is an economic cycle, but as we agreed in what this argument was going to be, we're looking at now, right? We can say that hopefully 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 20 years from now, that the economic conditions are better. That would be fantastic. And in fact, we would strongly encourage that there are more museums at that point. But at this point now, which is what the argument is about, now, Rob, there are too many museums. They cannot sustain themselves. Anybody in this room has gone through resource cuts in the last 2-3 years that have gone through layoffs. You know from your own institution that there aren't the resources to fund and keep doing what you are doing now. That's a pragmatic reality. And so we need to say at some point, we need to be responsible. Let's hold back a little bit. It's not going to help that there are an additional 20 million museums around the world because those resources become stretched very thin. We find ourselves in a competitive race for the scarce resources available from foundations and funding that's there. It goes to a handful of larger museums. There are many small museums, But at some point, that is a finite resource. It's not just funding that's finite either. It's also the potential collections that are there. And I'd go back and say, both of you coming from an art museum, understand there is only so much good art in the world. Adding another 20 art museums, another 30 art museums of crap work is not going to make things better. Right now, 90% of your collection is not on display, not because it's fantastic art and you're racing to embrace that and show it to the world. It's because you've had to take it because it's not the good stuff, so you can have the few things that are good. We cannot all be the Metropolitan. We shouldn't all be the Metropolitan. No deference to Aaron in the back. IMA has some very good stuff, but again, it's not the Metropolitan. Not everybody can go for that in the first place. So be responsible. Say that there's not a point that you can't sustain, and it can't grow in perpetuity. Be honest with yourself. Be responsible. Hold back a little bit, and begin to say to yourself, you know, it's not saying yes that there should be a million museums, but maybe have some editorial control and exercise some restraint and say, maybe there are too many museums, and some of these new museums shouldn't be built yet, and eventually they'll be their appropriate time. Thanks.
Ms. Rosanna Flutie, are you ready?
I am.
Okay.
We are living in an age of crisis where cultural organizations and museums are under attack. We can debate how many or how too few, but the fact of the matter is that museums give us access to culture. Access to culture is a fundamental human right, and according to UNESCO's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, of my debate partner on the other side, Mia, had also referenced that everyone has the right freely to participate in the cultural life of the community and to enjoy the arts and the advancement of scientific community and its benefits, and also recalling in the same doctrine that the wide definition of future and the education of humanity for justice and liberty and peace are indispensable to the dignity of man. Fewer museums mean a denial of access to museums, which equates a denial of access to culture, which is also a denial to universal human rights. More museums mean more opportunities for participation in the cultural life of the community, and my debate partner, Rob, will also outline that. More museums can embrace more civic and social responsibility as they expand and diversify more audiences. More competition between more museums will ensure the long-term health for the field and more opportunities for professional growth. If we can look at the number of museums right now and the amount of jobs that are available, and we were only to be limited right now to the number of museums that exist in this possible time, then we will be essentially setting ourselves up for the finite amount of opportunities in the field. Bruce had argued that there were some times where there were not enough resources and not enough staff, but precisely by having more museums mean that there are more places for us to pollinate between organizations and learn from one another. If we look at the financial impact, which I think is also one very fair to examine, that many of us are operating and competing against each other for resources, but the fact is that if we are competing, and competition is a basic fact of elevating the field, museums are a place of excellence. And if we are competing against one another, we're also forcing each other to be better. If I were to look at the way that philanthropy or the way that art museums are potentially singled out as some of the places that most easily can come under attack, they're also the ones that I think we have the hardest way to define for their benefit of the culture of society. But if one goes back to this idea of access to culture and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that if we limit the ability for us to have access to these places, especially in nations that do not have the places for these to have an extended look at our benefits of culture, we risk it to be in humanity can really be in decline. I think it's fair to look at the finances at this point in time also, because there's no doubt that we actually do have a fiscal crisis on our hands. But when we look at also the very nature of how our museums are doing, some of the most, I think, easy ways to look at this is that was really no easy way to define what we're measuring, that we each have different ways to count this and different ways that we're trying to be able to assume different types of right. I'm going to just go through, because Rob and I had extended conversations about what countries or what places actually have museums. We were looking that there were 55,000 museums in the world, 17,500 that are here in the United States, which means we actually hold 1/3 of the amount of the museums. But if you look at the Democratic Republic of Congo, 65 million people there, per capita income of only $1,800, and that we only have one museum there. And if you were to look at actually the place of Sudan has 42 million people per capita income, but only has 2 museums in the entire nation. And why should we feel a limit to put an artificial limit on this if we already have too many museums?
All right. So that's the conclusion of our opening statements. We move to the audience cross-examination, and I'm going to ask those of you who have questions to queue at the mics. The first round of questions, we are giving last year's debaters a chance to ask the first round of questions. Aaron Coburn, Len Steinbach, Nancy Proctor, Ms. Beck-Tench. If any of you have a question, you are welcome to come up to the mic and go first. Otherwise, I saw that Erica was ready with a question there. Len? Oh, excuse me. I just a little on the question format. The audience members, you may address your question to one or both of the teams. If you address your question to a specific team, the other team has an opportunity after the response by the first team to reply. And if you and otherwise, I will designate the first responder based on a rotation. Okay, Len, shoot.
My question is to Bruce and Mia. I'm interested in why you think that there should be significant areas of population who do not have access to any museum at all. If you say there should, that would mean there should be more. And I'm also wondering whether you are looking for some sort of centralist or socialist or death for eliminating certain museums, whereas market forces would simply indicate that we have the right size because the market forces would dictate those that would rightfully disappear.
We would create a museum death panel that would review.
That's a great question, and I'm glad you asked it because it gives me the chance to address the misconception that too many museums means there are too many museum experiences. We love museums. We think museum experiences should be in everyone's everyday lives.
Yeah.
We think outreach is a really important part of what it means to be a museum. That's not tied to the physical venue. There's nothing that says if you close museums, then there's no way of having culture in people's lives, that they can have experiences of their history, that they can understand the natural world around them. If we can acknowledge the situation in museums, then we can start to innovate and think more clearly and more cleverly about ways of getting museum experiences out there into the world that aren't tied to old ways of thinking about running organizations and running brick and mortar venues.
You're also right about the economic cycle of things, and so that's one of the things that we looked at in the definition is it's now, right? We hope that in 10, 20 years that the situation is different, but if we look at the current norm, we have a fundamental dilemma.
How much is my response time?
You have a minute.
A full minute.
Mhm.
Okay. Len, that's a great question. And museums of all kinds are delivering value to everything from hospice care to school children. And I think that I've really appreciated Bruce taking a step kind of outside the norm to assert that museums are the ones that judge the value that they deliver. And in fact, it only makes sense to say that the communities that we serve are the ones that get the right to say whether or not we're providing them value. So there's another fallacy that the opposition is trying to weave into the discussion here, and that is related to the issue of too many museums. That measure is one simply of total number. It doesn't require that the same museums that exist today will always continue to exist, but only that the overall raw count of museums should be less than it is. So when you make arguments about quality and such, it's just kind of an artificial construct to distract you from the fact that there are not too many museums.
Hang on just a second. We're just going to do a little mic check because I hear that this mic
So
here.
if I lean a lot closer, is that better, Aaron? Closer? Sweet Jesus.
Okay. Erica?
Wait. So, like, that's okay? Or still not quite enough?
Okay.
Wow.
Actually, Leo, can you bring us that mic there?
All right, so now I'll do it this way. That'll be fine. This will be fun. Awkward much? And this works?
No, it's your voice.
If I just really project, does that work?
No, video. Video.
Not for the video.
Can this one work?
All right. Is it not on?
How about this? Oh, that's good.
And that works reasonably well? All right. Where did... Leah. Come boy.
Erica, you're on.
Okay, so I was just, it struck me that both sides actually are making arguments that have some implications for experimental culture, and I was wondering if I could actually hear from both sides on this, because on the affirmative side, I was very concerned by your emphasis on economic viability and popularity, which I think could actually end up
I don't think we use the word
suppressing-
popularity,
I'd-
but go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, attendance.
I'm just trying to understand her question. Sorry, Rob.
Attendance numbers in that case, if we're going to. But yeah, I think that we need large public platforms for new ideas and experimental culture. On the flip side, I'm concerned that these kind of permanent institutions who are entrenched are in some ways providing a normalized variety of experimental culture and not something that is truly experimental. And so I'm wondering if both sides can kind of address how museums could or couldn't be engines for social change, cultural change.
Okay, that question is first to the negative side.
What's wrong?
Ready to go? Let me know.
Does this still work?
Go.
So the question about experimental culture, or at least being able to provide different opportunities for these things to happen in museums, I thought Bruce brought up a really important point, that also the fact that 90% of our institutions' collections are aren't seen by the public. If there were more museums and more opportunities to be able to pass these through organizations that are nascent or just built or just starting right now, that aren't entrenched in some preconceived notions of what their mission are, but could actually embrace much more expansive missions and also look at issues of human rights and other ones that we've outlined, we really haven't been able to see yet quite the limits of possibility.
Thank you for the point about permanence in museums, and I'd like to point out that permanence doesn't mean old. Permanence just means that you exist and do good work to the point where your community values your existence and can come alongside and support you with resources, either fiscal resources, time, ideas. That's what permanence means.
Okay.
It's a curious definition of permanence. Whenever I think of something permanent, I imagine the longevity of it. And kind of a permanent institution is one that does have an element of longevity. And so the fundamental part, when we look at that 90% issue of artworks on display, the reality is we know that many of those artworks aren't good artworks, especially by the museum quality of standards.
I'm not talking about art.
So go ahead, let me finish that. Of any kind of collection, but we specifically referenced art. So we go with the example that you used. And the fundamental dilemma there is spreading crap around to other institutions doesn't suddenly elevate the quality of the discourse or the cultural heritage of those particular things, and that's the disappointing part. The thing we want to look at is not that there can't be new opportunities for different museums and that we're looking at a baseline of numbers, but rather we want to make sure that the overall quality of museums stays elevated, that the collections that are there, the things that are celebrated are fundamentally able to be embraced at a very large scale. There's plenty of opportunity for experimentation, but some of those things don't need to happen in museums. We have cultural centers, community centers, churches, places of meeting, and all of those things also serve to satisfy the very fundamental ideas that the other team proposes of celebrating cultural heritage.
Thank you. Do we have some more questions?
I have a
Howard
question for Bruce and Mia. Actually, two questions.
No, you have one question.
I'm sorry?
You have one question.
Okay. So my one question
question,
is your assumption for having less museums due to economic crisis that
We didn't advocate for less museums. We should be clear on that.
that there are too many museums, assume that money, those resources that are scarce right now, are going to be spread out more to the museums that are left, and also when you talk about too much art that isn't good, who's the arbiter of whether it's good or not?
Frequently, it ends up being the museums that are the arbiter of those things, right? Because they hold those things in reserve. They don't put them on display. And we frequently had discussions in the Denver Art Museum of much of the art that we had there. We acquired it because it wasn't that we actually wanted that art. It gave us the opportunity to get other art. And so we ended up being an arbiter of those sorts of things. The other dilemma that we run into is that it's not just a first world problem of looking at the scarce resources, right? We try and make sure that while there's plenty to go around here, that there are fundamental issues of making sure that things are sustainable in other environments, in other countries, in other institutions, and that they can properly celebrate those particular things.
I mostly work in social history museums, and the collections that we have are reserve collections, they're reference collections. They're there because they don't actually make much sense on display.
So to fill up the last 10 seconds of time that we have, one of the real things that we look at as the rise of opportunities like what this conference represents, it's a sharing of things online and of those resources. They don't need to happen in a particular museum.
You have the opportunity to
I'm ready.
Okay.
So I'm curious that the opposition talks about access to resource and resource depletion, calls it a first world problem. In 2010, Credit Suisse issued a report stating that the total global wealth is actually slated to increase by a whopping 61% between 2010 and 2015, driven primarily by the rise of the middle class in the Asian Pacific region. So it's not that we're accumulating more of the most wealthy, but in fact the thing that's driving that increase is the middle class. So these are the exact same areas that struggle with a lack of museums. Furthermore, I challenge the resource allocation by pointing out that only a small percentage of America's 17,500 museums receive any federal funding of any kind, and that museums are among the best cultural institutions at making use of volunteers, serving over 1 million volunteers serving museums, 8.1 billion hours, and an estimated value of 173 billion.
Just to talk about organizational structure, we really need to stop entrenching ourselves in these old ways of thinking in terms of volunteership and Skillshare.
Okay, one last question.
What criteria are we going to use to measure if the museums are contributing to the public good?
That question is, sorry, to Rob and Rosanna first.
All right. So again, I've said it before and I'll say it again, the only way we can determine public good is by what the public says that good is. So we are only existing in a competitive environment where some museums will succeed, some museums will fail, but we say that new museums will be created and the total number of museums won't decrease. So in particular, museums demonstrate value in a lot of different ways. The opposition brought up the position of trust, that museums are losing trust, but they didn't offer you any clues as to how to base that. In fact, I have evidence that says from AAM that in 2010, 38% of Americans cited museums among the most trustworthy sources, and 87% they were trustworthy overall. Indiana University had a study that indicated that the public trusts museums more than the historical information in books, teachers, or even personal accounts by their grandparents. So I would say that the community is telling us that museums do deliver value to them, and we should do everything we can to create more and new museums that can give us even more of that value.
Rob, you're right about the rise in Asia. You know, I go to a report on AA Consulting about that the effort is driven in part by China's plan to build 1,000 new museums by 2015, and the commitment need to fill them with something. The long-term rise of China and Russia's collecting powers pose a triple threat to collections in Europe and the museums that house them. Many of the leading museums in Europe today lack sufficient acquisition funds and the tax framework to encourage gifts of art. Their economies are not meeting the plutocrats and hedge fund collectors who donate collection items and funds, and their collections lend themselves increasingly to restitution claims. It is exactly part of the problem that we're trying to discuss here. And if we're going to turn a blind eye to it, we are naive and foolish.
So going back to the point about measuring public good, I would say, is it discoverable? Is it relevant? Is it secure? Is it accessible? Do we manage that now? No. We have so many hobbyist museums. We have museums that are just not doing a good job. We need to focus on helping museums do a better job, and we need to think about how we're going to resource that.
Okay. All right. That was the end of the audience question section. We are going to move into the cross-examination, face-to-face cross-examination by the debaters. This is going to run this way. There will be 2 sets of questions asked on each side. First, Mia and Bruce will have the opportunity to ask a question of Rob and Rosanna. Rob and Rosanna will have a minute to answer, and Mia and Bruce will then be given an option for a 30-second reply, which they may take or pass on. Then Robin Rosanna will ask a question, Bruce and Mia, and Robin Rosanna yet again. So are you guys ready with your first question? All right, go.
You know, I was struck by a quote from a few years ago from the future director of the Dallas Museum of Art, and where he was belaboring over the issue of, as museums try and expand, that they're trying to capture new attentions and create new audiences and figure out different ways to do that. And he called it a compromising sponsorship to clean up the bottom line, and really it was in response to the Guggenheim and looking into creating an expansion-minded fast-buck corporation looking for all the world like a chain of theme parks. I wondered if you could respond to that and how we manage that issue.
I don't hear a question.
I wonder how you respond to that and how we manage that issue. I'll repeat the last clause. That was the question. I was giving you some information to respond to.
I don't
So
think.
sorry, clarify the issue.
Right.
But you talked too fast. Can you repeat what you said?
Sure, I'll talk slower for you, Rob.
Thank
I'll
you.
be helpful. So, Max Anderson had commented about the Guggenheim and its expansion of trying to create new opportunities and looking at new ways to innovate. That was really kind of looking more like a chain of theme parks, was how he's quoted in Forbes magazine. And it was interesting, right? Because every museum is trying to deal with audience issues. I was curious how we begin to deal with that and manage that as a long-term issue, because I'm assuming that's not necessarily a good thing.
Great.
So my question is, how do you manage that?
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
No, go start.
I'd like to begin by talking about relevance of experience, because I think what we're finally seeing are opportunities for people to connect in ways that they haven't even previously conceived before, that we haven't had a chance even to talk about what places we might catch them and what part of experience we might capture them.
And I think the critical point there is that experience should be an authentic experience, because those are the ones that research is showing are driving the most impact in our culture. And so earlier the opposition talked about the influence on children and their memory. And it just doesn't make any sense to me, because we know that our US schools are failing. We know that schools around the world are challenged. But yet museums realize 90 million visits from school-age children and provide 18 million instructional hours every year. Other data from the NSF for science museums shows that experience with science and technology centers is a precursor for interest in science and adoption of scientific careers in their adulthood.
30-second response if you want.
It's interesting that you point out the issue with schools and how they're failing us. I'm under the fundamental impression that they're failing due to a lack of resources, and that's why they're failing our children, which seems very parallel to the situation that we're looking at here, does it not?
Do we get an answer? Yeah, no. You do not. I know you saw the
We have a great answer.
You of course are the next. You of course are asking the next question.
We were looking at the amount of money that the United States, for instance, and just to take the United States as an example, we spend $650 billion in defense. We spend $550 in education. Billion, to make sure we said that correctly. In what opportunities could we speak more clearly about the educational value of museums and how less amounts of museums would actually help that goal for education?
I think we need to go back a step and say, are we demonstrating the value in museums? And maybe the reason that we're not demonstrating the value in museums is we have too few people who know how to do that. We have too few programs that really do that. We're not getting funded because people don't see why we need to be funded. There is some money around, but I'd argue also that in places like the UK and Europe, there are such severe funding cuts at a local level that museums are just closing left, right and centre. So there might be resources, we might not be making a strong case for resources.
You know, to that point, Tim Calton points out in hands-on exhibitions that there are simply too many museums chasing too few visitors, especially in the UK. With museums competing in a very overcrowded leisure market alongside its commercial attractions, it's just not a viable opportunity. It's a fundamental problem. You know, and we're discouraged by what we see out there, so we want to try and be realistic about it. That's the fundamental thing. Be realistic in where we're going. We're not looking at a place down in the future in 5 or 10 years. We're looking at now.
30-second response.
Okay, so again, you guys are paying attention, I'm sure, because I shared with you that global wealth increases by 61% in the next 5 years. 5 years. What Bruce and Mia are talking about when they're providing examples of waning resources are about current fiscal resources, the places that museums are already seeking value. I think no one would disagree with the assertion that museums should continue to provide value to their communities, and those are the communities that are actually gaining the wealth in the next 5 years. So of course, the total economic availability has increased.
Thank you. All right. Another question from Mia and Bruce. Last one before your conclusion. Make it good.
I don't have a question. Yeah, we're going to punt.
Okay. You guys ready with a question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you want to ask it? And ask. You want to do these two? Okay. So if the opposition is asking you to believe that, in fact, there are too many museums, I'm curious what the metric...
Is this addressed at us or the audience?
No,
I'm not sure.
I'm asking you the question.
Oh, okay. Misunderstood.
I'm
Thanks.
curious what your metric is for determining what the correct number of museums should be, how you would measure that, how you would ensure that museums that should not be a part of that are eliminated, and what you would do to ensure that any new museums are not expanding that number.
Fortunately, this isn't a policy debate. We're not here to present plans and ideas about how we begin to manage this as a long-term thing. The thing, to go back in your last comment, Rob, is that you look at things down the road in 5 years and 10 years, and as you've been quick to point out in this debate, we needed to agree on common definitions. And as you recall during the initial calls of what we said we're going to debate, i.e. museums, what their definition was and how we would consider it, we also looked at the proposition of what now was, and we said it was now. It wasn't 5 years from now. It wasn't 10 years from now. So, I take a little umbrage that you're willing to now step away from those definitions that you so carefully coveted early in the conversation. It's unfortunate and disrespectful to the conversation. But that having been said, at the same time, I would counter with the question to you of how would you actually manage the role of museums going forward? What would be the plan that you would implement in place to review that the museums that are being created are of sufficient quality and standards and actually do promote cultural heritage around the world, that they're properly managed in other countries and in the first world? You're right about wealth growing, but how do we make sure that's spread around in places around the world that it's manageable?
Very good. Okay, so for those of you that watched the last debate, what we decided was that museums not run as businesses will ultimately fail, and we appreciate you for voting for that direction. Now, what should be repeated, though, is our initial point that museums exist in a competitive environment, and it's competitive for resources. It's also competitive for mind share and public value. Who determines what museums exist are the public. So the public is the one that determines whether your museum continues to exist at all.
Okay. Did you change your mind? Okay. No? No? All right. We wrap with 5-minute responses, team responses, first from the affirmative side and then from the negative. So Bruce and Mia will share the stage for the next 5 minutes, and then Rob and Rosanna, and then you get to vote. Okay? Let me know when you're ready to go.
I think I'd just like to start by saying that I agree with Rob in a way that we should be asking the public what they value in museums. But certainly in the UK, the public's voting and they're saying they don't value museums. Museums are closing. There's more activity going on defending libraries than there is defending museums. So we're not making that value case. Maybe in the UK, there are too many museums, and that's what the public's telling us.
I'd go back to some of our economic arguments earlier and looking at how we do that. Rob, you're absolutely right. Last year we agreed that museums run as businesses are an important thing to look at, and it's an important policy to follow. One of the things as we were looking at the economic data for the United States, it turns out that the median earned income in this country is about $7.22 per visitor. And when we do that out, the math on that, it's about a $6.5 billion industry related to cultural heritage and people visiting what they spend at museums. what we end up having to look at then is with the number of museums that are present and exist in society, how does the $6.5 billion get spread around, and how do they properly sustain the programs that they want to do? You're right. Maybe in 10 years, in 20 years, the value proposition will be different, that museums will be a sustainable thing, that they're a fundamental part of the community, and they're seen as a valued resource, that people will increasingly go to them, but nonetheless, we look at now. And so the case is that the museums that exist now and the way we run them now, it needs to satisfy the current need for that. And then on the flip side of that, I begin to look at international policy, and looking at the $7.22 contribution per visitor, is you go pointing out that in particular African countries, there are a scarce number of museums there. You're right. And the question really becomes, if you're going to run it as a business, what's a long-term sustainable cultural heritage approach that makes sense for that country? It is reasonable to say, and if they're government sponsored, I've worked at the National Museums of Kenya, and it's done only through the direct support of the government itself, that it has to be done in a sustainable way, and that government has decided this is the appropriate number of museums in the country. It's not that they're trying to go for an expansionist policy or they see any reason to compete with other countries around the world. They're doing what is right for them. And so rather than dictating that there should be more museums around the world, they're willing to say, you know what, we have made the investment that we need to make at the current time in the cultural heritage sector, and it's an appropriate investment.
Yeah. I think arguably we're saying that museums are valuable, that nothing that we're saying is anything against the amazing experiences that museums bring to the public, the role that they play in society. What we're saying is that museums aren't currently valued. What the public's saying is we don't value museums because possibly there are too many museums.
One of the things we also looked at was congressional studies that looked at museums in the United States. And from editorial research reports in Congressional Quarterly a few years ago, they talked about, by carefully examining and defining the range of their activities and their audience, museums in the future can eliminate or reduce services that are duplicated by other cultural and educational institutions in the community. Some museum professionals feel that there are too many museums in this country and they tend to be overextended. That was the opinion of what was written into the record in the government. And really what it began to look at is that many of the needs that we identify don't need to be fulfilled by museums. You're right, there's a need to embrace the things that build up our heritage. There are plenty of other organizations in our community that can do that. They don't need to be mandated at a government level, and they can emerge as they are. They don't need to be a museum by the definition that we had established for ICOM. Along those same sort of lines, you know, the New York Times was beginning to look earlier this year at kind of the overall elements of museums. And really what they saw was that the major problem is that there are too many museums with too much space to fill. Too many museums with too much space to fill. And this goes back to this fundamental notion of there are a finite amount of collections that exist in the world. You're right, I wish there was a number of things that existed that we could constantly fill new museums and do additional things, but it's a pragmatic approach of saying what are the resources that are there and what are the effort that it needs to take to sustain those things. Conservation is a critical issue in most museums, and we need to look at these resources that are available to sustain that.
I think also just going back to the ICOM definition of a museum, which is ideally a permanent institution in the service of society, can you really say that every single museum that exists now is in the service of society? We have vanity museums, we have hobby museums, we have commercial museums, we have a creationism museum. Are you really saying that not one of those museums has a place in the world?
You know, and I think I begin to look at it as just how we begin to operate the individual organizations that we have now. There's been an increased need to drive visitors to museums. We look at the increased fees that are part of that. I think the things that we see now and the way that museums react to it are an excellent indicator of the economic struggles. And we've seen a number of museum closures over the last couple of years as a relevant indicator of the trend that even by their own admission, there are too many museums. And so, you know, as we realize with that, it's not that the economic problem is, or that there's a cyclical issue, but rather it amplifies the existing problem that's inherent in the structure of museums in the first place. Again, the emphasis here is that we don't, it's not that we don't believe in museums, we don't believe in the value of museums, but we wish to be responsible about it.
Thanks, Bruce and Mia. When you guys are ready.
All right. So Bruce and Mia have asked you to believe a number of things. Their argument essentially boils down that there are too many museums because we have depleted our resources. They have pointed out to you that we have a fiscal crisis. They have talked about a lack of trust or a possible loss of trust. Our side has pointed out to you that global wealth will increase by 61% in the next 5 years, as it has in the previous 10 years. We addressed their question of trust by providing you hard evidence that over 80% of Americans trust museums overall, and they trust them more than books and even their grandparents. They talked about how museums are doing a poor job of working with kids to form memories, and so our audiences are at risk in the future. We showed you that museums do a vital job in providing educational services and resources to over 90 million school visits. Basically, their argument boils down to a scarcity of resources. And I think we did some important things, and I've noticed a number of you on Twitter mentioning that the funding agencies are deciding what's valuable because the funding agencies are the one that are giving us the money. And what I would assert is my fact from the AAM's 2010 stats survey that a very small number of the museums, even in America, are receiving any funding at all, and from the federal government or from other funding agencies. So I think it's clear that museums are very resourceful in figuring out ways to continue operations. To address the fiscal crisis in our country, I think it's all been clear to us that economies are uncertain. Nonprofits, arts, and culture businesses, according to the Pew Cultural Data Project, have contributed $166 billion annually and employ 5.7 million individuals. So if we actually decrease the number of museums, we're only encouraging a continued fiscal collapse. In addition, the U.S. Conference of Mayors found that governments which support museums and cultural investment on average see a return of $7 for every $1 that they appropriated.
I think we can all agree that the best stories make for the most dramatic. That when we're looking at different types of examples of where museums fail, or how many museums are spending way beyond what their means are, or how few people who are able to staff these, or how few resources we have amongst the most of us, I keep thinking actually of some of the more extreme examples that we haven't even mentioned here. On one hand, we do have a teeny tiny museum like the Baked Bean Museum, or a museum that might exist in a small part of Wales where, true, maybe that seems frivolous, so why would we have a small museum like that? And yet, what if someone on the other side of the globe is trying to grow beans for a meal or for sustain their society, and suddenly can tap that wealth of that knowledge of that one curator who's volunteered or been paid a slight amount for their time and knowledge, and suddenly could radicalize a community. On the other side, $315 billion that have gone into the museum that opened last Tuesday, Crystal Bridges. I don't know if anyone's been following this story, but the very fact that somebody would have that much money and to be able to give that over to an art museum shows that actually there is a huge philanthropic organizations or individuals willing to be extremely generous. We just have to be much better at how much we articulate our goals and our mission. And I'd add that at the same time last week, about the same amount of money went into Cornell West Hospital. And the fact that somehow maybe hospice care is being better defined, or at least they're getting smarter and more articulate about how they're defining their mission and their wealth and their value to society, it's just raised the bar for us.
Rosanna brought up the issue earlier about the association between access to culture and human rights, and we shared with you a surprising statistic, particularly about the Sudan, which has 42 million people, a small number of income, but only 2 museums. I went and I referenced the Amnesty International's website about Sudan to kind of check out how are they doing in terms of providing a great environment for their citizens and their culture. And I was not surprised to find out that in the last 12 months, more than 60 people were sentenced to death, 54 by special counterterrorism courts. Torture and other ill treatment were widely reported. The use of cruel, inhuman, and degrading punishments has persisted, and at least 12 women were flogged after police arrested them mainly for wearing trousers. I think that museums can play an important role in accessing the cultural thinking that can attempt to change some of the injustice that we've been seeing in the world.
Thank you very much. Rob might have finished that thought, except that Rosanna slipped in a little reference to last year's debate. The debaters today were challenged by Len Steinbach
I was told to. I was given a note.
The debaters were challenged by Len Steinbach, who provided one of the highlights of last year's debate by starting out, I think, with hospice. Good enough is not good enough, and Rosanna has won a drink of her choice from Len. Meanwhile, Rob didn't. Oh no. I'll buy the rest of you a drink. All right. All right. Anyway, thank you so much to our smart and funny and thoughtful debaters. Yay. All right. So that concludes the actual debate section. We're going to vote. Our president and queen is going to join us up here to do the count. All right, this gets a little complicated, so I want to make sure that everyone is paying attention. Hands up again, those of you who voted at the beginning of the debate. There are too many museums. Keep your hands up, keep your hands up, keep your hands up. All right, those of you who changed your mind over the course of the argument and no longer believe there are too many museums, keep your hands up. The rest of you who still believe there are too many museums, you can take your hands down. Okay?
Did you change your mind? Or just put your hand down? Okay, thanks.
Wait, did you count?
Yes.
Okay.
I counted 6. Wait, you counted 12?
Okay,
Do it again.
can we do this again?
Make this easier. Who that originally voted for it changed your mind? Put your hand up. And on the flip side, those of you that changed your mind, put your hand up.
Okay. No, wait, come on. That was a little bit confusing. Okay, those of you who actually voted at the beginning for the negative, there are not too many museums. Can you put your hands up again? Okay. And those of you who actually changed your mind over the course of the argument, keep your hands up, everybody else.
Did you just vote the same way again before?
Wait,
Joaquin?
Joaquin?
Voted twice.
You voted twice? Both sides were really good. You guys rock. All right.